Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Agnes Zhu Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, as well as all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Mellon Foundation. Along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors, none of the work of New York Historical would be possible without your continued and committed support. As the founding director of our Center for Women's History, I am proud of the growth we have achieved here at the center. In only a few short years, we've been able to accomplish so much in terms of scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all of which foreground women's critical role in American history. Tonight's program will run approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. At any time during our program tonight, please submit your questions through our Q&A portal located on your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can. And now, I am delighted to introduce our speakers. Our moderator this evening is Anna Danziger Halperin, our Associate Director at the Center for Women's History and a co-curator of the Salem Witch Trials Reckoning and Reclaiming exhibit, currently on view and which inspires and informs today's program. Anna was previously a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in women's history and public history here at New York Historical. She is a public historian of gender, care work, social movements, and public policy. Her work has been published in the Washington Post and many scholarly journals. She's worked on several exhibitions with us on our women's history team. Anna received her doctorate in history at Columbia University. She's joined by Frances F. Denny, an internationally exhibited photo-based artist, editorial photographer, and screenwriter whose work investigates female identities. She is the author of two books, Let Virtue Be Your Guide, and Major Arcana, Portraits of Witches in America. She is the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts 2016 Fellowship in Photography and has won numerous awards, including PDN's 30. Frances received an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. We're thrilled to have Anna and Frances with us today. I will now turn the conversation over to Anna, who will get things started.
So thank you all so much for being here tonight and to hear our conversation with Frances F. Denny. We are so delighted to have had the opportunity to meet you, Frances, and to delve into your work in our exhibition. When Valerie and I first went to Salem, Massachusetts to visit the exhibit at the Peabody Ethics Museum, we were so taken with your work, seeing it in person. It's so incredibly stunning. And so we are so delighted to have your portraits as part of our exhibit and to have this opportunity tonight to speak with you and really delve into your project in so much more depth. So to start off our conversation, can you tell us a little bit about the origin points for your work? Are there particular artists or writers that have shaped your path?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Anna, and thank you, Valerie, so much for the lovely introduction. So my work focuses on the development and formation of female identity and selfhood and the various factors that impact that development. I've always been interested in portraiture specifically, in thinking about how a photograph of a person can really inform a viewer's understanding of them. This slide is an early body of work of portraits I made when I was just getting started in photography. But really my interest in female identity and representation began when I first encountered feminist theory in college. Mary Wollstonecraft's 18th century treatise, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, I remember just blowing my mind because so much of what she was writing about then felt still so timely to me back in 2003, as a young woman. One line I remember in particular was this one. She wrote, "Taught from their infancy, that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming around its gilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison." So in the book, she's advocating for women to seek empowerment through education, not through the pursuit of beauty or like delicate manners. And I know it sort of seems obvious to us now on some level, but I was so compelled by the way she framed this problem as a kind of conspiracy, right? As if women are conditioned to be keepers of their own prisons. And it just made me want to understand how that conditioning happens. The next book that really affected me so much was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which she wrote in 1949. It felt to me when I read it like a kind of calling. And I know that this is maybe the most famous quote from The Second Sex, so please excuse the kind of coffee mug nature of putting this up on a screen for you. But her idea that one is not born but becomes a woman is a perfectly succinct nutshell of what I'm interested in as an artist. In other words, what are the ways that we are conditioned to be womanly or feminine? How are we taught to be girls and taught to become women? So each of my subsequent bodies of work since college has looked at this kind of central preoccupation through different lenses, whether it's the family, as you'll see in a moment, or pop culture, or looking at a kind of gendered archetype. I'm really interested in how identity is influenced and formed. In this next slide, this is so fun getting to share all my very favorite things with all of you. So this is a picture of a sculpture by Janine Antoni called Umbilical. And I first saw it when I was in graduate school. I saw it at the RISD Museum. And so it's a cast. I know it's a little hard to see, but it's a cast that the artist made of her own mouth and her mother's hand connected by a spoon. And, it's about, this, it's 8 inches long or something. So if de Beauvoir gave us the idea that one is not born but becomes a woman, then it kind of makes sense, right, that the family would be the first influence on a child, that first arbiter of what is funneled or channeled into a person. And for me, this sculpture just so elegantly encapsulates a sense of kind of matrilineal or familial inheritance. To me, it asks, what is passed down, absorbed, inherited, and to what extent does that affect the formation of a sense of personal identity? You can imagine that when I found out 5 years ago that I was pregnant with a girl, with a daughter, I was really afraid of what that would mean for me and figuring out how to be a parent to a girl. Not that being a parent to a boy is any easier, but in any case, that was something that really hit hard.
Yeah, as a parent to 2 girls myself, I totally identify with that.
Okay, good.
So how did you begin to integrate this theme of the formation of the female identity into your work?
Yeah, so I started really close to home, literally. I mean, looking at myself and my family. In grad school, I was photographing in New England, which is where I grew up. And at some point, I found this exhibition catalog of colonial girls embroidery samplers. So for those of you who don't know, samplers were used to teach girls decorative embroidery. You can see like these intricate floral decorations and domestic scenes, exteriors of houses. There's even bits of scripture and the ABCs you see sort of along the top there. You can see she's stitched her ABCs. So to me, this piece is like a kind of antiquated primer of how to be a good New England girl. It's all here in this image. Make things pretty, keep your house, be observant to God, and obedient to your husband. So that really served as another kind of source of inspiration. But let's go ahead and look at an excerpt of the body of work that I produced as my thesis, which then went on to become my first book, Let Virtue Be Your Guide. So it's a kind of response to those notions of traditional femininity. And yes, I did borrow my title from Cynthia Burr's Sampler. So for the series, I photographed many of my female relatives, as well as the domestic scenes that they occupy, or domestic spaces, really, the homes that they grew up in or live in, kind of as a way to come to terms with this particular version of femininity that I grew up surrounded by, and to kind of trace the ways in which those ideals are shifting across generations. that first slide was a cousin of mine, Edith, and she's featured repeatedly in the series. And I think of her as a kind of surrogate for myself in the photographs. I never met any of my grandparents. I grew up with a good deal of curiosity about my family history. And at one point during a conversation with my relative, I learned that our ancestor, John Howland, was a deckhand on the Mayflower. Legend has it that he actually fell off the ship at one point during the voyage across the Atlantic, and someone threw him a line and hoisted him back on board. And he went on to have something like 10 children. So there are actually quite a few descendants of John Howland out there. But the more I learned about my ancestry, the deeper I dug, the more complicated my feelings grew. And this is a funny term. I still don't know if I can assume that it's like colloquial, but the word WASP, right? It's an acronym for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and I don't see it as derogatory. It's honestly just the kind of best word I have to define my own cultural heritage. So anyway, one of the things that became important to me while I was photographing was to not glorify this WASP world, to not render it like some kind of Ralph Lauren, catalog, to not sort of show off these quite stately old homes, but to search instead for places of wear, places where we see the seams of things, where surfaces are wearing away. And I'm also just pictures of my generation with images of older generations, sometimes using paintings or photos on the wall as kind of stand-ins for generations past. That's a picture of one side of my family tree, framed in one of these houses. I photographed up and down the East Coast in about 9 different homes scattered between Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. And the pictures, as you can see, really blend. That's Edith again. Portraiture, still life, and landscape. So yeah, then for the book, and actually in the last slide, can you go back, Sarah or Anna, whoever's driving? Yes, so that's my mother standing in Salem Cemetery, Salem, Massachusetts, and she's actually looking at the memorial to the people who were put to death for being witches, right? Which we will come back to in a moment. So little did I know at that point that I would be coming back to Salem in such a real way. So there's this reproduction that, it's this sort of accordion fold out, and there she is, my grandmother on either end of it, and in between is this massive wedding tent, as if that's the kind of focal point of her marriage portrait. Anyways, I thought that was such an interesting object. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's really the kind of nuts and bolts of that series.
That's so interesting. So as we've discussed already in our intro, our exhibit on the Salem witch trials features your project, Major Arcana. Can you tell us about the process that led you to photograph and interview modern day witchcraft practitioners? How did you first learn about that, your own connection to Salem?
Sure. So, when I was researching Let Virtue Be Your Guide, I spent a lot of time, as you now know, looking at my family tree, and I discovered that one of my ancestors, Samuel Sewell, here he is on the left, was one of the judges in the Salem witch trials. And then on another branch of that family tree, I also found out that I'm descended from a woman named Mary Bliss Parsons, who was accused of witchcraft in Northampton, Massachusetts, about 20 years prior to the Salem trial. So they would not have known one another. Sometimes people ask me that. And that's her house. It's a picture of her house, where she's still standing in Northampton. But that coincidence really was the spark of everything for me, that I'm descended from the kind of like oppressor figure of this moment in time, as well as the oppressed. And that was kind of tricky to reconcile. It felt at the time, this was in 2015 or something, 2014, kind of thorny enough that I filed it away for later use. And then a few years later, was reminded of it when I was reading Stacy Schiff's fantastic historical account of the Salem witch trials, and realized that one of the main characters she was talking about was my ancestor. So from there, I began thinking about the figure of the witch as a kind of historical scapegoat, as an archetype, as a word that has really acquired a whole lot of baggage as it sort of traveled through time over the centuries. And I also became aware that there are people out there who practice witchcraft, who have reclaimed that word from these really murky origins. And that really intrigued me. I wanted to find out, who are these people? What is a witch? What does a practice of witchcraft entail? And also, I have to say, after doing such a personal kind of inward looking project, even though I'm not literally in the pictures, it was really exciting, almost liberating to look outside myself and dive really deeply into a world that I knew nothing about.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier about the theoretical underpinnings of your work have largely focused on female identity and identity formation. Can you tell us how Major Arcana ties into that for you?
Yeah, I mean, part of how I think about that formation is through examining the models that were given at an early age, right? My daughter's age, she's 5, or the specific representations of gender we're exposed to early on. So in that series, I was thinking about the immediate cultural framework an individual is raised within, which of course is different for everyone. And then in Major Arcana, I'm looking at archetype as a kind of model, as a container. It's amazing how early they are embedded in our psyches. Fairy tales are just rife with these archetypes: queen, mother, maiden, whore, witch. The Bible has them, Disney movies have them, Hollywood loves an archetype. The witch is often depicted as either a baby eating hag in the woods with like a hooked nose and green skin, a wicked seductress, or my personal favorite, as like a vain, jealous woman of a certain age. I hate that saying so much. Hell-bent, it's the worst thing, hell-bent on, preserving her youth. But what interests me about the witch archetype, no matter the flavor, is that she's subversive in her autonomy. As my friend Pam Grossman puts it, she wrote the foreword to my book. She's an amazing person. You should all get her book. She's in the series. As she puts it, witch is never defined in relation to a male archetypal counterpart, right? King, son, hero. She is distinctly kind of autonomous in that way. And also, one thing I want to mention, because I just heard myself say it, is, I do use the words she and woman when I'm talking about the witch, because of this sort of undeniable historical association between witch and woman. But Anna, as you know, that there are individuals in Major Arcana. Well, the series represents a wider gender spectrum than just female. There are trans and non-binary and genderqueer individuals in the series, and that was really important to me from the jump. So should we look at a selection of images?
Definitely take a look at some of them. And while we do, let's chat a little bit about, can you tell us the process for how you found your subjects?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I didn't know a thing about the witchcraft world. So the first thing I did was sort of set out to learn as much as I could about it before I began photographing. You can email me for my reading list if you want, but it did include, Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon and Starhawk's Spiral Dance and Barbara Ehrenreich's Witches. What's it called? Witches, Midwives, Healers, I think. It's terrific.
Midwives and Nurses. I always get the order.
Nurses, yes, thank you. Yes. Probably on your bookshelf too, right?
It is. I'm looking at it.
Yeah, a terrific book. And so once I got the kind of lay of the land, I wrote a letter, which was basically an artist statement talking about my kind of ancestral calling to do this project. And I used that letter to reach out to people. And I remember being really nervous about reaching out to people, like I didn't want to offend anybody, hey, are you a witch? So I did it very gently and carefully and really honestly about where I was coming from. And I started with people that I knew that I had a kind of hunch about. And from there, I got connected to others. And then once I had photographed 10 or 12 people, things just kind of took off and was introduced to like entire covens of witches all around the country. I also joined a moon circle and did some scouting on Instagram and at witchcraft festivals. There was one, I don't know if it's still happening in New York, called Witchcraft. Incredible. But everywhere I traveled, I would also visit the local occult bookshop or botanica, because there is no like central university to learn about witches and witchcraft. It's not a centralized system, so you have to kind of do some digging. And I found that there's so many of these shops. Almost every major city in town that I visited has one, and that was really such a source of the community, of finding this community that really has been pretty underground for a very long time. Yeah, and after 3 years, I think I photographed around 75 people around the country.
It's amazing. And visually, the portraits are all really different in the way that people are sitting, and the way that they're posed, and the kinds of places that they're standing. How did you go about directing the portrait sessions?
Yeah, we were just on Dia's portrait, which was definitely my first time in a sex dungeon. It was really fascinating. She was so generous with like telling me what was what. But I made the shoots as collaborative as I possibly could. Whenever logistically possible, I would ask my subjects to choose the locations of their shoots as well as what they wore, with the idea that those choices would reflect something about their identity as a witch. They would often also bring objects to the shoot. Later on, they were also invited to contribute texts that were then incorporated into the book and then into subsequent exhibitions alongside their portraits. And I'm so excited, Anna, that you had the idea, I guess 9 months ago, to turn those texts into audio components for our show, which I'm sure some of the people here have been to the show, and the voices, there are 8 witches who are reading their texts one by one. They're in the room with you. And it just felt like such a great natural extension of my original intentions for the work. And so I'm just so excited that the room is full of their voices now. I guess one other thing I would mention is that, I feel a huge responsibility as a portrait photographer in how I represent my subjects, especially as an outsider to this world of witchcraft. I learned so much from each and every one of them, and I didn't want to be reductive of their beliefs and senses of themselves. Plus, many of them are really wary of being further stereotyped. So there's a lot at stake. And in a sense, the very act of making a photographic portrait is a reductive act. You're turning a 3-dimensional, living, breathing, thinking human being and distilling them into a single dimension, a static frame. So the choices I make about how I represent a person, particularly, within the context of a photo series about witches in America, has to be really intentional. So I worked hard to give my subjects as much agency as I possibly could throughout every iteration, really, of this project.
So after photographing these 75 individuals from around the country with all these different ways of coming to their practice, what were some of your impressions about what a sort of modern witchcraft entails?
Right. Like, what was the answer to my question? Well, I realized almost immediately that representing diversity in all senses of the word would be core to this series. It had to represent a diversity of faces, of body types, of ethnicities, of ages, of geographic locations, and of belief systems. I think for a really long time, witchcraft has been sort of perceived to be like an Anglo-American tradition solely, and it's just so much bigger and richer than that. And so truly what I discovered is that there's really not just one way to be a witch or look like a witch or act like a witch or practice like a witch, and I knew early on that the series would have to reflect that. So, each person I photographed embodies a different kind of witchcraft, whether it's aligned with a religion like Wicca or Voodoo, or a self-defined practice. Many people do consider themselves pagan, and many don't. There are those who practice mysticism, who engage with the occult. You have politically oriented sort of activist witches, polytheists who work with a whole pantheon of goddesses. There are tarot readers, astrologers, those who practice spellcraft, and quite a few herbalists or plant-based healers. Many of them call themselves green witches. There are also space witches in the series, kitchen witches, head witches, sex witches. It's really just such an individualized identity, which is frankly what kept me so interested the whole time. And it's what I love that you can't pin it down. It's not just one thing. And so I think, like, at the end of the day, if witchcraft is all these different things to so many different people, what is it at its very essence? And to me, when I think about it, I think that it is about cultivating a kind of inner power or strength or resolve. It's about being in tune with yourself and with the earth, and for perhaps finding a kind of alternative system for processing the world around us. And I think when you think about it like that, witchcraft doesn't seem all that supernatural. It seems frankly like pretty human. There's a lot of things that we do that are helping us find alternative systems to process the world, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's turn to some of your new work. Can you tell us about what you've been working on ever since? Does it build on your past explorations of the occult?
Well, I mean, so I guess I would say more recently I've been drawn to still life, which specifically to looking at how objects and materials can be kind of suffused with energy and narrative. And a question that came up a lot with Major Arcana is whether or not I consider myself a witch, and I don't, just simply because I don't have any kind of intentional sort of spiritual practice. But the more I thought about it, the more that I feel that the act of photographing is a kind of magic. So I wanted to create pictures that feel like enchantments, that evoke a sense of magic and play. And these photos really refer to photography itself. So that alchemy of vision and light and glass. Photography, yes, it is chemistry and optics, but it's also totally magical. As anyone who has spent 5 minutes in a dark room can totally attest. And so I made these images in my studio using props, filters, smoke, as you can see here, blur, refraction, to kind of conjure the magic that's intrinsic to photography. So these are my kind of ingredients for these magic spells. The pictures also refer to childhood, as you may have noticed, to the kind of materiality of kids. I know that my personal sense of play has absolutely been changed since becoming a mother, and I let that come out in the pictures. That wasn't the original plan for them. So each image has a kind of interruption from a child, like the blur of like a sparkly tutu or a scribble or a toy or even a snack. And as you've also seen, the pictures all feature flowers. Flowers are arguably the most ubiquitous subject in art history, possibly aside from women, right? Women. Flowers are beautiful, but they're fragile, they're delicate, they're kind of deathly even. And there's definitely, a metaphoric tie-in between flowers and women's bodies. So anyway, that's what I've been thinking about with this new series, and it's exciting and a little nerve-wracking to show it for the first time, but I think that's about it for the sneak peek.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for showing that. Through your work, and it's really exciting to see where this will go. You've also told me that you're taking up a new medium, which is of screenwriting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's connecting to your photography as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like most people, I was stuck at home during lockdown, and I had time to teach myself as much as I could about screenwriting. I wrote a script, which is an adaptation of Charlotte Bronte's Gothic novel, Jane Eyre. I hope many of you remember reading it at some point, maybe in high school or college. And my film is set in contemporary mid-coast Maine, and it's a thriller. And I've got two really wonderful producers on board to help me make the film, Rose Ganguza and Sarah Hollis. And we're currently looking for the perfect director. So that's where we are with it. But it's been really, really fun learning a new medium.
Yeah, and Jane Eyre is one of those books that I think a lot of women's historians are familiar for. It's in a way that it speaks to women's history and literature. But can you tell us a little bit about what Jane Eyre that specifically spoke to you?
Yeah, I mean, what fascinates me about the original novel is that the archetypal mad woman in the attic character was born with Jane Eyre. Bertha Mason, who, for those of you who may not remember, is this sort of secret wife of Mr. Rochester, and she's depicted as this like snarling creature locked away in the attic, setting things on fire, including late in the novel, not to spoil it for you, herself, and also the house, which is called Thornfield, which is where I got my title. I mean, Bertha Mason has been written about in literary theory and reimagined in Jean Rhys's novel, Wide Sargasso Sea. So I'm definitely not the first person to get swept up in this character, but honestly, I really related to her on this personal level. I felt like a mad woman up in my attic studio during lockdown. And I really came to think of Jane Eyre as a kind of ghost story. And then, Jane herself is such an interesting character. She's really unconventional in literature. And I think this is a nice place to end, maybe, is this quote from Karen Swallow Prior's essay. I think it's from 2016 in The Atlantic. I'll just read it. Jane's quest for her true self peels back the stiff layers of conventionality in order to discover genuine morality and faith. So, Jane Eyre is a story about a woman who sorts out for herself what virtue is and how she wants to move through the world. She defines her own moral compass, which is so radical for a female character at that time, right? I mean, maybe still. And if you think back to Simone de Beauvoir, I like the idea that perhaps it's up to every individual to figure out how to become a woman or how to become yourself. That's the ideal, right? And to me, that feels like real virtue, the pursuit of one's own authenticity.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Frances. We have time for just a couple questions. And so if folks want to put questions into the Q&A feature, I will be delighted to ask them to Frances. Here's one that came in. What music were you listening to when working on Let Virtue Be Your Guide and Major Arcana?
Interesting. Joni Mitchell, probably, and always Nico Case, who she just is the one I always reach for. I've been listening to her since I was, a teenager, and I just adore Nico Case so much.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Those are such perfect examples too of I think women who are looking for their taking out claims of their own identities too in their music. And
totally, absolutely right. Yeah.
We have another question about how, after your portraits have come out, they were published in Major Arcana, how have your subjects responded?
So I think very, very excited. They seem to be excited, and as surprised as I am that this has become a book and exhibitions, and now this exhibition is toured, and it's just so exciting. And many of them, I think there are 25 of my subjects who are authors themselves. And so I think that it's been really exciting to help, bring their work to the fore as well. And they've brought mine. So it's been really lovely to kind of keep in touch with so many of them whenever possible. And I just feel unbelievably grateful to them for, answering that email way back when, being part of this project. And then also so many of them, I think 2/3 of them contributed text pieces for the book that then went on to be in the exhibition. 8 of them came in to record their audio for our show. So I feel incredibly grateful to them. And also, it's important to remember there's still something at stake in being publicly out of the broom closet, as they put it, as a witch. There are parts of this country, there are definitely countries in the world where it's absolutely not safe. And, several of my subjects shared with me that I can think of two that, had their identities as witches used against them in family court or in divorce proceedings. So, I think it's important to remember, like, as a New Yorker, like, it's easy to forget that this is this word still has danger attached to it. And so I just feel just ever grateful to them for being part of this and for continuing to support it. And I just feel lucky to still be in touch with so many of them and count several of them as friends.
Yeah. Here's a comment. I would love to hear more about the sort of racial and cultural influences in certain witches' practices and what you found surprising or compelling or influential to your own identity.
Interesting. Well, as I said, it was really important to me early on to be as reflective of the diversity of this community, which you can almost not even call a community because it's made up of so many different practitioners of different belief systems. And several of those belief systems are, religions, Wiccans, capital S, the W, like a Christian or a Jew or Muslim. I also was able to include several voodoo practitioners, and voodoo practitioners don't typically call themselves witches in the pagan world. But when I explained to them what I was talking about in this series in regards to archetype, they understood, and several of them wanted to be a part of it. So I feel grateful that they were open to that. But I think that, learning about voodoo and Santeria and all of these things was really enriching to me. And I just hope that people get a copy of my book and read what people wrote about their own practices, because I certainly don't want to speak for them. I think that they spoke for themselves.
Yeah, they're absolutely so incredibly eloquent in speaking for themselves about those diverse traditions. Did some of your portrait subjects share how they came into witchcraft? Were there any sort of entries that have really stood out to you?
It's a great question. I did notice that there were quite a few people who grew up Catholic. And I don't know enough about Catholicism to really speak to why someone maybe who grew up with Catholic religion in their lives might be drawn to the kind of ceremony or pomp of certain ritualistic aspects of witchcraft, but I feel like there could be a tie-in potentially. But I also definitely observed that many of the people that I met and photographed came to witchcraft from trying to deal with a kind of trauma perhaps that happened in their lives, maybe as a young person. And witchcraft provided a kind of, I wouldn't say escape hatch, but a kind of a way of contending with their past trauma. So I did notice that was a theme for sure with how people came to it. And then the last thing I would say is there was a book that so many of my subjects pointed me towards when I was, getting the lay of the land and meeting people. And so many young witches were reading Starhawk's book, The Spiral Dance, which I then read and was just floored by. And it really helped me understand this idea of magic, right? This is a word that is sort of bandied about in the witchcraft world. And I frankly came to it feeling a little skeptical, like, what do we mean by magic exactly? What does that mean? Because it has these kind of hokey connotations, right? And it wasn't until I read Starhawk's book where she's quoting another witch whose name is Diane Fortune, but she says that magic is the art of changing consciousness at will. And for me, that seemed so human and like any number of things that I do on a daily basis or a weekly basis, right? To kind of like get stock of my life and try to understand what's happening in the world, right? Like psychotherapy or other religions. or, having a cocktail at the end of the day. It's so human to need to try and change our consciousness to get a different angle on something. And so if we're calling it magic, great. I find it finally clicked when I read that.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. I think we have time for one tiny quick question. This is the last one. Is there a significance to the name Major Arcana?
Yeah, so Major Arcana refers to the tarot deck. So there's like the tarot deck, I think it's 78 pictorial cards, and there are, I believe, 22 that are considered the Major Arcana, and they're kind of the most important symbolic cards that, I hate to use this term, but they're kind of like the trump cards in the deck. They're really important and infused with all this significance. And I just loved many of the people I photographed kind of came into witchcraft also with astrology. And not with astrology, with tarot. And so tarot, though maybe they don't practice now, it is this kind of entryway into witchcraft. And so I thought, alluding to that was important. I also love the sound of it. It sounded important. It sounded serious. And this is a subject that I really wanted to be taken seriously.
We're unfortunately out of time. And thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I want to thank Anna Danziger Halperin and Frances Denny for being with us today. I hope you'll all join us for a visit in the museum to see their remarkable work. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming salons like this one. Finally, the New York Historical Society is currently open on Tuesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West soon to see Salem Witch Trials Reckoning and Reclaiming on View Now at the Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery through January 24th. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.